All right, so today we're diving into something that's super relevant if you're thinking about buying a home in South Florida.
We're talking FEMA flood codes.
Exactly, those zones on the map that tell you just how risky it is to live in a certain area when it comes to flooding.
Yeah, it can be a bit overwhelming to wrap your head around all those zones and codes.
But don't worry, we're going to break it all down for you.
That's right.
Okay, so picture a map with different zones. Kind of like those weather maps, but for flooding.
Right.
Our source material mentions zones A, AE, AHV, and then X with two variations, shaded and unshaded.
Yeah.
What's the story with all these zones?
Basically, each zone represents a different level of flood risk based on things like the area's history of flooding, the elevation, and how close it is to waterways.
Okay, so like a risk assessment for flooding.
Precisely. So, for example, Zone A means there's a 1% chance of flooding annually.
A 1% chance.
Yeah, 1%.
That doesn't sound too bad, right?
Well, over a 30-year mortgage, that 1% annual risk actually turns into a 26% chance of experiencing a flood.
Oh, wow. So basically like flipping a coin.
Yeah, you got it. That's pretty much your chance of dealing with a flood at some point during your mortgage.
Okay, suddenly those odds are looking a lot less appealing.
Right.
What about those AE and AH zones?
You're right, those both sound pretty similar.
Yeah, they do. What's the difference?
Both AE and AH zones are considered high-risk areas, but Zone AE maps actually include more specific information about base flood elevations, or BFEs.
BFEs. Okay, hold on. I need a translation here.
You got it.
What exactly is a BFE?
Think of it as the estimated height that floodwaters could reach in a specific area during something called a 100-year flood.
So like the worst case scenario flood level.
Exactly. Now, of course, that doesn't mean it only happens once every 100 years.
Right, that would be a bit too easy to predict.
Yeah. But it basically means there's a 1% chance of that level of flooding happening in any given year.
Got it. So it's kind of like rolling a 100-sided dice.
Yeah.
Each year you roll, there's a chance you could land on that unlucky number one.
Exactly. And that represents that major flood event.
Okay, that makes sense.
Good.
So if you're building a house in one of these high-risk zones, you've got to factor that BFE into the design, right?
Absolutely. You'll notice a lot of houses in these areas built on stilts or with elevated foundations. It's all about protecting your investment from those potential floodwaters.
So it's like building a fortress against the rising tides.
Exactly. And it's not just about elevation either. Building codes in these zones also often require specific flood-resistant materials and construction techniques for things like plumbing and electrical systems.
Ah, so it's all about minimizing that potential damage.
Exactly.
It makes you realize how much thought really goes into building in these areas.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so then what about those V zones?
The V zones. Those are all about coastal areas.
Okay.
They face the added threat of strong waves, which can be incredibly destructive.
Yeah, those hurricane-force waves can really pack a punch.
Exactly. And because of that, building codes in V zones are even more strict. They require extra reinforcement to resist those powerful forces.
Got it. So if I'm dreaming of a beachfront property, I need to be aware of those extra challenges and costs that come with it.
Precisely.
Okay, what about those X zones, shaded and unshaded? What's the difference there?
So think of the shaded X zone as like a middle ground.
Okay.
It still has a moderate risk of flooding, about a 0.2% chance annually, but flood insurance in these areas is typically less expensive.
Makes sense. And the unshaded X zones?
Those are the lowest risk category.
Mm-hmm.
In a lot of cases, flood insurance might not even be mandatory.
Interesting. But even in those low-risk zones, wouldn't it still be smart to consider getting flood insurance just in case?
It's always a good idea to assess your individual situation and consider all those potential risks.
Yeah, it's better to be safe than sorry.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've learned about all these different flood zones. But how do you actually find out which zone a property is in?
That's a great question. There's actually a fantastic online resource called the FEMA Flood Map Service Center.
Okay.
You can just plug in an address and it'll show you exactly which flood zone a property falls under.
So you can see the risk level right there on the map.
Exactly. It's a game changer for anyone looking to buy a home in an area that might be prone to flooding.
That sounds super helpful, especially when you're trying to make those big decisions about where to live.
For sure.
But let's be honest, deciphering flood codes and understanding all these zones can be pretty overwhelming.
Definitely.
Especially if you're not a flood expert. What's the best way for someone to approach all of this?
You know, honestly, having a real estate expert who really understands the ins and outs of the local market can be your greatest asset.
Someone who can help you decode all of this.
Exactly. They can help you decipher those FEMA flood codes, assess the real risks, and ultimately guide you towards making those smart decisions that protect your investment.
So finding the right real estate agent is just as important as finding the right house.
Absolutely. It's all about having someone on your side who can help you navigate this complex world of real estate.
I see where you're going with this. In the world of South Florida real estate, is there anyone who comes to mind?
Oh, absolutely. Antonio Ortega from AntonioOrtegaLLC.com. He's got a deep understanding of the South Florida real estate market, and he's particularly knowledgeable about flood zones, building codes, and insurance requirements.
So he's not just going to help you find a beautiful home. He's going to help you find a home that's safe and protected from potential flood risk.
Exactly. He's passionate about making sure his clients are making those smart, informed decisions.
And speaking of smart decisions, didn't you mention that Antonio is offering a special incentive?
Yes, he's offering 10% of his professional fee towards your closing costs.
Wow, that's a fantastic deal.
It is.
So for anyone out there thinking about buying a home in South Florida, especially in those flood-prone areas like Broward County, Antonio Ortega, sounds like the real estate expert you want on your side.
Absolutely.
Be sure to check out AntonioOrtegaLLC.com to learn more about this incredible offer and how Antonio can help you navigate those tricky waters of the real estate market.
Don't let the fear of flood risk hold you back from that dream of owning a home. With the right guidance and expertise, you can find a place that you love that's also safe and sound.
Well said. We've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive into FEMA flood codes. So let's take a moment to let all of this sink in, and when we come back, we'll dive even deeper into those specific flood zones and what they mean for you as a potential home buyer. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to our deep dive on those FEMA flood codes.
All right, so last time we were talking about all those different zones.
Right, all those A's and X's.
Exactly, and how they basically tell you the flood risk for a particular area.
Right. Each zone has a different level of risk.
Okay, so let's focus on those high-risk zones for a minute.
You mean like zones A, AE, and AH?
Those ones. What kind of impact do they have on things like building codes and insurance?
Well, in those high-risk zones, you're going to see much stricter building regulations.
Okay.
For example, anything new that's built has to be elevated above the base flood elevation.
Ah, that's why we see all those houses on stilts.
Exactly. It's not just for those ocean views. It's all about protecting your investment from potential flooding.
So those stilts are like a safety measure.
Right. And it's not just about elevating the house itself. Think about using flood-resistant materials and specialized installations for things like plumbing and electrical systems.
It's about minimizing that potential damage.
Exactly.
Okay, so what about insurance in these high-risk zones? I imagine that's a whole other thing.
Absolutely. If you've got a federally backed mortgage on a home in a high-risk zone,
Yeah,
flood insurance isn't optional.
it's mandatory.
You got it. And those premiums can really vary depending on the specific zone and how high your property is elevated.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
Not at all.
Okay, so let's say I'm looking at two properties. One's in Zone AE and the other is in Zone X unshaded. What kind of difference are we talking about in terms of insurance costs?
Okay, so let's paint a picture. You find a dream home right on the water in the Zone AE.
Okay, sounds lovely.
But because of that higher risk of flooding, you could be paying thousands of dollars every year just for flood insurance.
Wow, that adds up.
Now imagine a similar home in Zone X unshaded. That's a lower risk area. You might not even need flood insurance, or if you choose to get it, the premiums would be much lower.
Okay, so understanding these flood codes before you even start house hunting is super important.
It's crucial.
You don't want to fall in love with a house and then find out you can't afford the insurance.
Exactly. It's all about making informed decisions from the beginning.
So for anyone thinking about buying in one of these high-risk zones, having a real estate expert who really understands these flood codes is key.
Definitely.
You need someone in your corner who can walk you through all of it,
Exactly. They can guide you through the process and even help you negotiate the best deal.
all while making sure you understand the potential costs involved.
Precisely.
It sounds like you're describing Antonio Ortega.
Oh, absolutely. Antonio from AntonioOrtegaLLC.com, he's got this incredible knowledge of the South Florida market, especially when it comes to flood zones, building codes, and insurance.
Yeah, we were talking about him before the break.
Right. He's not just trying to close a deal. He really wants his clients to find a home that's a good investment for the future.
A home that's safe and sound.
Exactly. And remember, he's offering 10% of his fee toward your closing costs. That can make a big difference.
Yeah, that's huge.
It really is.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about those high-risk zones. What about the more moderate and low-risk zones like Zone X, shaded and unshaded?
Right. Even though the flood risk is lower in those areas, it doesn't mean they're completely immune to flooding.
So there's still some risk.
Always.
Those flood maps are based on historical data, and they can't predict everything.
Exactly.
So even in those shaded and unshaded X zones, it's still a good idea to do your homework and maybe even consider getting flood insurance.
I agree. It's always better to be safe than sorry.
Peace of mind is priceless.
Yeah,
This all makes perfect sense. But is there anything besides flood risk that buyers should be thinking about when they're choosing a property in South Florida?
that's a great question. There are actually quite a few other factors to consider. We'll dive into those after a quick break.
Sounds good. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We've been talking all about FEMA flood codes and what they mean for home buyers in South Florida.
And right before the break, we were talking about some other important factors to consider beyond just the flood risk.
Right, because it's not just about staying dry. There's a whole lot more to think about when you're choosing a place to live, especially here in South Florida.
Exactly. South Florida has its own unique set of challenges and rewards for homeowners.
So what are some of those things that people might not be thinking about?
Well, one thing that often gets overlooked is windstorm resistance. We live in hurricane territory here.
Right.
So while flood insurance is definitely important, you also don't want to underestimate the impact of those strong winds.
So it's not just about the water. It's about making sure your house can actually withstand a hurricane.
Exactly. When you're looking at houses, make sure you pay attention to the building codes and think about things like impact-resistant windows and doors.
Oh, yeah. That makes sense.
And make sure you understand your homeowner's insurance policy and what it covers when it comes to wind damage.
Good point. It's all about being prepared.
Exactly.
Okay, so what else should we be thinking about?
Another thing to consider is how close the property is to the coastline.
Even if it's not in a high-risk flood zone.
Right. Even if it's not in a high-risk zone, being close to the ocean means you're more exposed to things like salt air corrosion, storm surge, and erosion.
So those beautiful ocean views come with some extra things to think about.
They do. It's important to factor in those potential maintenance costs that come with living near the coast.
Makes sense.
Think about things like using rust-proof materials and maybe even finding contractors who specialize in coastal construction.
It's all about being aware of those hidden costs.
It is.
You've given us a lot to think about. It's not just about the house itself. It's about the whole environment surrounding it.
And that's why it's so important to have a knowledgeable real estate expert on your side. Someone who can help you see the bigger picture.
Someone who can help you find a home that really fits your lifestyle.
Right.
Speaking of experts, I think we both have someone in mind.
Antonio Ortega from AntonioOrtegaLLC.com. He's the best.
He really understands the South Florida market inside and out.
He goes beyond just finding you a house. He helps you understand all those factors we've been talking about, the risks, the rewards, the long-term implications.
And he really wants his clients to make smart decisions.
Absolutely. And don't forget about his amazing offer. 10% of his fee goes toward your closing costs.
That's a huge help for any home buyer.
It is.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into FEMA flood codes and South Florida real estate, what's the one thing you want our listeners to remember?
I'd say the biggest takeaway is that knowledge is power. When you're buying a home, especially in a place like South Florida, being informed is the key to a smooth and happy homeownership experience.
So do your research, ask questions, and find an expert you can trust.
Exactly. And if you're looking for that trusted expert, look no further than Antonio Ortega.
Head over to AntonioOrtegaLLC.com to learn more about his services and that fantastic offer.
Don't just dream about owning a home in South Florida, make it a reality.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive. Until next time, keep learning and keep asking those great questions.